what bureaucracies, if they're functioning well, do is at least have some sort of sense of identity or face-to-face interaction at each level of the hierarchy. There are ways to sort of establish these hunter-gatherer tribes even within massive organizations.
Welcome to This View of Life, where we take a deep dive with the best and brightest thinkers on anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am your host, David Sloan Wilson. For more interviews, articles, videos, and special publications, search for This View of Life on your favorite search engine.
Hello, I'm Max Beilby, filling in for David Sloan Wilson. Today, we'll be discussing modern business from an evolutionary perspective with my guest, Mark van Vugt. Right, well, let's jump straight into it. So, welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining me today. To start, can you please tell us a bit more about your background? So, you are a professor in evolutionary and organizational psychology at VU Amsterdam, and you're also a research associate at the University of Oxford. What drove you to pursue a career as a psychologist, and what are your main research interests?
Well, I started off as a psychologist, an experimental psychologist, doing actually lab studies to understand how basically social environment changes people's decisions. Things like group size, for example, how does that change the way we cooperate, etc. And I got interested at some point in hierarchy and leadership because that obviously is one way in which societies manage these cooperation problems by installing an authority or a leader to solve this problem. And then I discovered actually that there was very little research looking at social dilemmas, these cooperation problems, but then how leaders can be used to solve these problems. And that's when I started reading a bit more into the anthropological literature on leadership and also the political science literature. And before I knew, I stumbled on this fascinating area of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary behavioral sciences, where people with all kinds of different backgrounds, including psychology, anthropology, economics, biology, come together to understand the issues regarding leadership. And I haven't turned back since.
Fascinating. Thank you for that overview, Mark. And just to clarify, you mentioned referring to the anthropological literature as a way to explore these matters further, so around leadership and hierarchy. But, you are a professor of evolutionary psychology, and I wonder, is there a particular article or book that changed your worldview? Or to put it another way, I know a lot of evolutionary psychologists almost have a coming out story as a Darwinist. Was there a specific moment for you where you discovered this material and changed your worldview?
Yes, I think it was a nice sort of coincidence between something that happened to me privately when my son was born in 2002. I had some time off work to obviously care with my wife for him, and so I took some time off work, and I also had to start a new course at the University of Southampton, where I was working then. And I had given courses already on social dilemmas and cooperation. But then I came across a book, I think it was actually a gift from a friend of mine. It was called The Origins of Virtue by Matt Ridley, who's a science journalist, well known, of course. And there he basically explained the evolution of cooperation from ants to human societies and anything in between. And I was really fascinated by that. And it, as I said, it coincided with the birth of my son, which was in another way sort of evolutionary significant affair. So I think that brought together an interest that was dormant, I think, already for over a few years, because I was quite disillusioned with my own field of social psychology and the kind of proximal or maybe superficial mechanistic explanations that we offered. And then I came across Origins of Virtue, and I thought, hey, there's a whole world out there studying cooperation, but also hierarchy in different animal societies. And humans are just one of these species that is interesting to study these phenomena.
Thank you for that, Mark. As you say, both a important life event, but also discovering the work of Matt Ridley led you to discover this view of life, which is quite profound.
Right.
And speaking of books, congratulations on the release of your new book, Mismatch, which
Thank
I
you.
believe was published. You're welcome. I believe it was published in English in March last year. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Great.
I wrote it with a novelist, which was an interesting experience with Ronald Gippard, who is quite a well-known novelist in the Netherlands.
And can you tell us how this partnership came about? How did a evolutionary psychologist and a famous novelist in the Netherlands end up writing a book about evolutionary mismatches?
Well, we at the VU have this institute. It's called a novelist in residence, which is done through the Faculty of Humanities. And so they invite every year or every half year, they invite an author or a novelist to give workshops to students about writing, etc. And one day, this man walked into my office, Ronald Gippard. I obviously knew him from his books and television and whatever. And he wanted to know more about psychology. He was particularly interested in the phenomenon which we refer to as the wisdom of crowds. And he wanted to do an experiment to see if really a large group is smarter, a large group of ordinary individuals is smarter than the best experts in a particular field. So that's the question he came to me with, and he was interested when I talked about my work as an evolutionary psychologist, and I talked about some new idea I had about evolutionary mismatch and the implications for human well-being. And that set off a long journey where we regularly came together to write this book, helped by obviously his enormous knack for storytelling and my scientific expertise. And I thought that was a useful combination. The wisdom of crowds, by the way, never happened because we couldn't get a crowd of students to come to a lecture room to pull that off. But the collaboration was born, which eventually culminated in this book, Mismatch.
Excellent. Well, I think, as you say, the combination and collaboration between a scientist and a novelist works very well. I mean, a mismatch clearly is grounded in science, but it's also it's very funny. You tell lots of enlightening stories in the book as well, but do so in an entertaining manner, introducing these scientific principles, which is not an easy feat, but I think one you both achieved.
Right. Thanks.
And I think a place to start exploring your book. So the book is called Mismatch. It's about evolutionary mismatches. For those of us less familiar with the concept and the theory, what is an evolutionary mismatch, and why does it present such a compelling story?
Yeah, so a mismatch is really an inevitable consequence of the way evolution through natural selection works. Organisms, after a long process of basically selection, variation, retention, become adapted to their environment. But it's always an environment in the past because that's the way evolution works, an adaptation to a particular environment. But if an environment changes, and that could happen through some natural phenomenon like, I don't know, suddenly a mountain that pops up that separates two different populations, a famine or a drought. So through natural causes, or in our case, human-made causes, environments can quickly change, and that means that our adaptations are no longer well fitted to deal with these new problems. And that's really what is evolutionary mismatch. And it is applied really to any species. And it's an inevitable consequence of the way natural selection works.
Yes. And as you say, kind of linking this broader phenomenon from which we see in the natural world to humans and human society. So I think a fairly intuitive and obvious one for most people is deforestation and the impact that has on wildlife and various species.
Correct?
What's a good example of a evolution mismatch and the problems it causes for us? Is there a go-to example which you think is easy for us to grasp?
Yeah, so the often cited example, and I think that is now pretty well established, is our diet. So we humans evolved in environments in which we used to eat plants and meat, nuts, fruit, seeds, etc., and meat. But these environments were relatively scarce in terms of the amount of food that was available. So getting high calorie foods was really difficult, like honeycombs or fatty meat, etc., was really difficult to get by. And so, in order to survive as humans, we have a particular food preference whereby we particularly prefer fatty, salty, sweety foods because they're very nutritious and high calorie. Um, that obviously works well as an adaptation in an environment in which these food resources are difficult to get by. But of course, our environment has dramatically changed as a result of the agricultural revolution in particular. We now have around the world, in many parts, we have an access to cheap, high-calorie foods, and but we don't have the natural defense mechanisms evolved to resist those easy, accessible foods. And the result of that is mismatched conditions leading to obesity, cardiovascular diseases, and all kinds of eating-related problems. We call them lifestyle diseases, but they're really mismatches between ancestral and new environments.
Yes, but that makes a lot of sense. And in your book as well, you document and explore evolutionary mismatches across a range of domains in life, as you've given us that example from uh, dietary science, but also healthcare, romance, education, also business.
Correct? Yes.
In your opinion, what do you see as the most pernicious evolutionary mismatch, or the area of our lives which has been most adversely impacted? Can you pin it down, or is there
Well,
one which you think of?
yes. So I think the most poignant ones have to do probably with the problem of reproduction itself, and that is many modern societies suffer from fertility problems nowadays, and that is that the fact that women and also men delay the age at which they get children. And for women, it is particularly problematic because the age at which they get children, if that becomes older, it means that they can't get as many children as they probably initially wanted or thought they could have, etc. And so a fertility crisis is one of the outcomes of a mismatch whereby uh, we, men and women in particularly Western or modern societies, invest a lot in obtaining status and a career. We are educated for a long period in time, but after our education, the jobs start, and so we have to gain status and income through our jobs. And by the time we then think about starting a family, it is often quite late, and for some, it's too late.
Very interesting. So, in the ultimate currency of evolution, that is a You could describe that as a big own goal. Would that be correct?
Big on, yes, it's true. And what one could say, I mean, there's always people say, yeah, but isn't the world a better place without many people? And so overpopulation is indeed a real concern, but mismatch is particularly concerned with how particular new environments affect human psychological and mental and physical well-being. And for many people, not being able to conceive, get children, or get a large family is can be particularly painful.
Yes. And Mark, there are many directions we can take this discussion in, given the
Yeah,
ubiquitousness of mismatches. Given our mutual interests, it seems fitting that we focus on business and management in
right.
particular,
Yeah,
which you have a chapter dedicated to. And in Mismatch, you and Ronald write, mismatches arise when our primitive brains put us on the wrong foot by responding to cues that, in ancestral times, would have led to behavior that is beneficial to us. But in the work environment that we've created for ourselves, various cues cause us to make the wrong choices with adverse consequences for our well-being. Can you please elaborate on this point? What are some of the common wrong decisions you observe in the modern workplace, and what adverse consequences do these cause?
yeah. So in the chapter, we obviously go back to our ancestral world, the world of hunter-gatherers, and try and sort of discover what work was like in those environments. And um, that points to us to very important mismatches. So hunter-gatherers, when they work, I mean, work obviously is necessary because they need to, as it were, obtain calories to survive, and by because they need to obtain calories, they also need to spend calories in hunting and gathering primarily. But work there in these hunter-gatherer societies, and we know that because they're still around, some of them, luckily enough. Work is a mixture of physical activities, which can be unpleasant but are often also pleasant, but also play and sociality. And a lot of how hunter-gatherers work is with people they know. It's an arena to share social information, and they play while they work. And if we look at the workplace today, we see that workloads are quite heavy, demands on people are quite heavy, and that's one example of a mismatch. Hunter-gatherers also used to be generalists. There was, of course, some sexual division of labor in hunting and gathering, but our ancestors probably need to be good at a lot of different things. So they need to have skills in very many areas. And now, of course, if we look at the modern workplace, we see it's extremely specialized. Um, that means that there are jobs that are available that are not intrinsically motivating to do, the so-called bullshit jobs. And extreme specialization also has a problem of redundancies, because at some point your specialization may no longer be needed. I mean, if you spend 6 years on studying for a particular computer program, like, I don't know, Fortran or whatever they're called, and then a new a new program comes up which is much better. It may make you unemployed overnight. So specialization is, I think, extreme specialization is one of the sort of mismatches that modern work environments have to face with.
Yes. And it seems to be a key point you're making is this divergence between the environment we face now in the world of modern work and our great ancestors, so hunter-gatherer societies, and how they. Well, this is the key thing, isn't it? Right, that this concept of work is fairly new, where
Mm,
before it wouldn't really be seen as work. So, do you
exactly.
have any?
Yeah.
So, how do we make sense of this? Or to put probably a better question is, when did human economic activity properly take off?
Yeah, what usually is then given as a main cause is the agricultural revolution, which happened about 10, 12,000 years ago at several places on Earth. Now, remember that the human species is probably 2 million years old, or maybe even longer. So, for a very long period of time, 99% of our time as humans on this planet, we lived as hunter gatherers. So, uh, in small nomadic groups, hunting, gathering, with very little hierarchy, very little division of labor. Um, some people, anthropologists, refer to that as the original affluent society. It's a society where our needs were minimal, the needs to fulfill, and also working was minimal, and probably on average, our ancestors, if we go by modern hunter gatherers, spent about 20 hours a week working. Now, what has happened is a dramatic shift since the agricultural revolution, where we started to become sedentary. Because of the accessibility of food, there was a population explosion, and with that came specialization, professions, education, more and more education and training needed to fulfill all those specialized jobs. And so the agricultural revolution was a real water shift, a real shift in the way we organized ourselves. And one of the consequences was that we needed longer education, but we also needed to work much longer hours on sometimes very meaningless jobs.
Yes. So, in other words, all the benefits that come from modern industrialization, a lot of mismatch also explains the costs of that as well, and the impact on us psychologically, but also our physical health and physiology. Is that
Yeah,
fair to say?
I think that it's fair to say, and increasingly evidence supports all these mismatches. If we look at, for example, workplace stress, which is a particularly significant problem in modern organizations. If you look at the causes of work stress, one of the main things that people always report is interactions with their boss. Now, bosses didn't exist in our ancestral environments. There were leaders, sometimes individuals who are particularly competent at something like hunting or diplomacy or foraging or whatever. But these individuals were not bosses in the sense that they could tell you what to do. Our ancestors, these hunter gatherers, were fiercely autonomous. And so, if they didn't want to join a hunting expedition, they could simply not to go. It was really up to them. On the day, they could decide to join or not to join. Now, working under a boss in a organization where bosses can tell you what to do and what not to do is psychologically very stressful for many people.
Yes. And this seems to be a central point you and Ronald make in Mismatch, is that the hierarchical nature of large organizations are somewhat at odds with our evolved psychology. So, can you please elaborate on why this is the case? Why is it that large hierarchies present problems for individuals navigating such
Right.
organizations?
Yes. So one is obviously the fundamental needs that humans have for autonomy. And autonomy is obviously hindered by hierarchy. If people in the workplace tell you what you must do and when you have to do it by, that is creating a loss of autonomy for many people, and that's not what they want. Hierarchy also undermines people's social affiliations. I mean, anyone who is a manager knows that if they have an annual meeting with a worker and they criticize them, it's taken personally. Why? Because again, in our ancestral environment, there was really not no bosses, and so there was no separation between the person who criticizes you and the role of the individual who criticizes you, the manager. And so, as a manager, you can tell to an employee, well, I don't mean this personally, but I think you should work more hours. Then obviously the reaction is one of it's very defensive, and people get really upset by those criticisms. So hierarchy is, in that sense, uh, it's the antithesis of autonomy and relatedness, which are very important needs that humans have.
Yes. And you've already mentioned longer working hours being one of these novel
Yeah.
stresses introduced by the modern
And
workplace.
maybe I can add something about the hierarchy, because that's actually something we're doing at the moment. So we also assume that the sort of hierarchical organizations, the large corporates, for example, that were created first after the agricultural revolution, the empires, and then later turned into the multinationals after the industrial revolution. They were an arena particularly suited to men's evolved psychology, but not so much to women's evolved psychology. We know from research that we've done ourselves and many other people, including in developmental psychology, that men have stronger preferences for working in hierarchical organizations with one another because it probably is more fitted to their needs for competition and dominance, essentially. Women have a much stronger preference to work in somewhat smaller and more closely knit social networks. And these kinds of networks are not often seen in these large corporates that we've built over the generations. And so these kinds of environments, hierarchical, complex, multi-layered, competitive, may not be very much in accordance with women's need. And that may be one explanation for what we now refer as the glass ceiling effect.
Fascinating. Well, as you say, that I appreciate it's a complicated topic and various aspects to it. But the key point you're making, and which you also make in the book, is that the way modern organizations are set up is not conducive to women and women's leadership styles. So,
Yeah.
so you're what's just to jump to, potential solutions there. What sort of policies or incentives or structures would you recommend with that? With the with such a analysis and conclusion?
Yeah, there are obviously a few things that should be mentioned. One aspect we haven't discussed yet, but organizations are already piloting these, is the physical aspects of the workplace, because that's another important mismatch. Sitting in an office chair in a large how do they call it, a workplace with many cubicles, an open space environment, what have you, is also a kind of environment to which our fundamental needs are ill suited. We obviously, our ancestors worked in an environment where they were engaging in physical activity, the hunting and the gathering, social activities. Um, they were also always surrounded by nature while they were working. And so, what organizations increasingly do in the Netherlands, but also in other countries, is making workspaces greener and allowing workspaces or workspace only to be built if they have immediate access to nature. That is, that during breaks you can actually walk in a park where there is greenery, which relaxes you. We know that from research, etc. So that's certainly really one of the interventions that is important to stress. Um, the others are going back to our fundamental needs. Extreme specialization leads to what is often referred to as these bullshit jobs, jobs that must be done, but nobody really sees the point of them, and certainly the person who does them doesn't see the point of them. And so I think we should try and get rid of these kind of jobs by offering meaningful work to people, and that's what people want. They want to see how their contribution matters in a sort of greater process, what they contribute to some sort of collective good. We should try and increase people's autonomy in the workplace. The sort of 20% rule by some of these high-tech software companies like Google, internet companies, where they allow their workers to spend 1 day a week on a project of their own, which is usually related to what they do anyway, but it gives people some autonomy and personal freedom. Providing incentives for teamwork. Teamwork is really essential, was essential for our ancestors, because you couldn't really go hunting by yourself, and if you particularly wanted to hunt large game, you needed a team. So high levels of interdependence and a modern workplace. For example, where I work in academia, but also in other industries, in banking, etc., people get rewarded for individual achievements. But there are hardly any individual achievements, because everything that is done basically in terms of work is in terms of interdependence. So team incentives and team bonuses are really the way to go, I think.
Yes. Well, as you say, a lot of food for thought there. So, several implications for how businesses are run. One area which I'd like to delve a bit further with you is this topic of bureaucracy. So you've mentioned the term bullshit jobs, and of course, there is a large part of that is the nature of admin and bureaucracy in modern organizations. And I wonder, from your thoughts more broadly as an evolutionary psychologist, on the impacts of bureaucracy in its totality. So, in other words, bureaucracy comes with a host of costs. A lot of people find it, tedious at best, and soul destroying at worst.
Mm.
But is it a double-edged sword? In other words, is it attenuating some of the worst aspects of our nature, or is it minimizing and preventing some aspects which we would want to keep at bay? For
Mm.
example, informalities like bullying and
Yeah,
everything else.
yeah.
So do you have any reflections?
It's a really good point, and one that deserves, I think, greater attention and really scientific work to think about sort of the costs and benefits of bureaucracies. I mean, they are with us. There's no denying. Max Weber wrote about the bureaucratic organization as the sort of the final outcome of a sort of long process of cultural evolution. And so, but is it really the final process, the final outcome, and is it really a good example? And in a sense, this goes back to sort of theories about the firm. Why have an organization at all? Why not just have individuals who have goods and who want to sell it, and individuals who want to buy it, etc. And so organizations obviously make things easier to organize, and for that you probably also need procedures, etc. And so, but organizations also can become too oppressive, if you like, in terms of accountability, controllability, procedures, etc. And then you also need specialized jobs, going back to the specialization, people to fulfill each of these roles. And this is not the kind of, again, work activity that our human psychology has evolved to deal with. So it's probably not nice, not the nicest kind of jobs, and so, but they're necessary in a bureaucratic organization if you want to maintain them. I think there are ways to organize things better. So what bureaucracies, if they're functioning well, do is at least have some sort of sense of identity or face-to-face interaction at a sort of at each level of the hierarchy. So they may have multiple layers of hierarchy, but at each level there is still frequent interaction, face-to-face interaction between individuals. The heads of departments occasionally come together, the heads of divisions occasionally come together, the corporate board comes together occasionally, and so there are ways to sort of establish still sort of these hunter-gatherer tribes, even within massive organizations. But the dangers of and the costs of those organizations are real. I mean, the Roman Empire is often cited as one of the first bureaucratic organizations, and that went down overnight.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, Mark. As you say, it's not necessarily either or. It is the case that bureaucracies are well established across the industrialized world, but at the same time, there are either more fundamental changes or more adjustments that could be made within them to better fit, either work with or work around.
Yeah.
Our
No, I think
psychology.
that is true, and these organizations also become self-fulfilling prophecies in a way, and so they create their own dynamics in which it's very hard to sort of to avoid them or avoid working in them. But the consequence of which is that, for example, we now work way longer hours than our ancestors before. Certainly since the Industrial Revolution, we work way longer hours. I mean, it's now probably leveling off a little bit because we're now in a sort of new digital revolution where there are also sort of new opportunities to get around some of these mismatches. But self-fulfilling prophecies, and what we're saying as evolutionary psychologists, look at the 99% of our evolutionary time where we spend in totally different kinds of social structures, where people were generally happy, could fulfill the needs that they have. We would now call it a minimalist lifestyle, but that's a lifestyle that actually quite a few people nowadays of the younger generation are particularly fond of.
Yes, thank you for that, Mark. Right, I think going into the home stretch of this episode, I'd like to pose a couple of challenges to evolutionary mismatch theory and to get your take on it, essentially.
Yeah.
So my first one is from evolutionary biologist Kevin Larland. So in his book, Darwin's Unfinished Symphony, Larland argues essentially that we're coping rather well with evolutionary mismatches. So just to quote an extract, Larland writes, "Far from being trapped in the past by outdated biological legacy, humans are characterized by a remarkable plasticity." Larland goes on to write, "Hence, in spite of extensive change, both to ourselves, in our anatomy, physiology, and cognition, we humans nonetheless remain extremely well adapted to our surroundings."
Yes. Yeah, this is a matter of whether the glass is half empty or half full. And so, um, of course, at some level, he is right because of our cultural capabilities, the way we can learn of each other, we can build upon each other's knowledge bases, and improve the way we do things. Yes, we can adapt to environments for which we are not naturally built. I mean, we can live from the Arctic to the equator, and we will generally survive. And so, yes, culture does a lot indeed to buffer against sort of all the constraints that we are born with as humans, the physical, but also the psychological constraints. But what the glass is sort of half empty, if you like, if you consider that many of the sort of cultural innovations that we think of with our clever minds are experiments, and some of these experiments go bad indeed. I mean, we developed lethal weaponry that could at one time kill millions of people at the same time. I mean, nuclear weapons, for example, H bombs. So, who says that some individual that we give the authority over the power to unleash his weapons will not at some point use them? I mean, I would think that that makes Laland's argument totally obsolete. And so, or think about indeed leadership, how we now have situations where millions of people can blindly follow an individual who has a particular vision on their society, which includes the total destruction of other countries or themselves. I'm thinking Hitler, Stalin, whatever. So one cannot argue that these kind of cultural experiments, whether they're fascism or communism or even capitalism as a sort of social experiment, are entirely good for people, for those people involved. So I think it's a matter of where you want to look at, half full or the half empty glass.
Thank you for that, Mark. That was an excellent reply. And
Yeah.
I think this.
Sorry, I haven't even talked about the problem of climate change. I mean, think of the innovations in America where people at some point thought, in order to get more cars on the road, we need them to run more efficiently, and let's how do you say, add some lead to the petrol, because leaded petrol is actually it improves the way engines work. Well, we've seen what the consequences of putting a lot of lead into cars and then in the environment means in terms of the cost for individuals, sickness, death, all kinds of problems. We're still struggling to get around all the problems created by having lead added to gasoline in the first place.
Yes. So you mentioned the glass half empty analogy, and I think another book worthy of mention to compare with Mismatch is Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now. So to put it another way, I think Mismatch paints a more pessimistic picture of humanity and our future than the likes of Steven Pinker, who the book, I think, to oversimplify, quotes extensively from Our World and Data, research from Our World and Data, which shows advanced, remarkable progress in human well-being metrics across a range of domains and globally. So you may have answered this already, but how do you reconcile the likes of Steven Pinker and Enlightenment Now and the human progress that's been documented there with your book and the concerns that you raise in Mismatch?
Yeah, I think that's again. Let's not use the glass analogy here, but looking in terms of it at time horizons, and so yes, it is definitely true. No denying that around the world things have improved on certain indicators. We are with more people, we have more food, more people are living in democracies and all that. But it's also what you use as a comparison. And so if you use the Middle Ages and the empires as examples, where there was a lot of slavery, a lot of power differences and inequality, it's definitely true that some indicators look better. But there's also huge externalities produced by our behavior. I've just talked about climate change. I mean, you cannot, if you look at indicators of the way our climate is going, how we preserve other species which we lived for a long time together with. I mean, one cannot say that this is a really optimistic outlook. Inequality, I think, is also still on the rise in across the world. That is an increasing gap between the haves and have-nots globally, which creates all sorts of issues regarding, for example, migration. Lots more people coming to, for example, Europe and the US, creating also sort of externalities. And so, yeah, I think in the long run, even though over the last few hundred years things may have looked better on certain indicators, but looking ahead and looking to the next sort of couple of centuries, and that's I think what we should be doing as evolutionary psychologists. Things don't look always that rosy.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So I think this, as you say, this perspective of time horizons as opposed to, one's values and one's propensity to optimism. It's this time horizon. It's kind of the key
Yeah,
difference where you accept, various progress across various domains, but it is whether or not we can actually solve these problems that are presenting themselves in the near or long term future. Is
correct.
that fair to
Yes,
say?
that's fair to say. Yeah, yeah,
Great, thank you. So another point I'd like to raise is, well, within Mismatch in this episode itself, you've referenced the work of anthropologists Marshall Salins and Richard B. Lee
yeah,
and their theory of the original affluent society.
yeah.
That is, these hunter-gatherer societies have lived in, fairly comfortable lives and didn't work as much as we do in industrial societies, which counters to a lot of people's conceptions of how these people lived. However, some scholars have criticized these anthropologists' work. In particular, evolutionary anthropologist William Buckner, writing for Quillette,
Mm.
writes, while there is undeniably a great deal of sharing across hunter-gatherer societies, common notions of generalized equality are greatly overstated. So my question for you is, what are your thoughts of these critiques? Are these criticisms valid, and do they undermine some of the arguments of the original affluent society?
Yeah, I think so. So, what what I don't want people to take away from mismatch is that it's all doom and gloom, and that our ancestors lived in a sort of Garden of Eden or a paradise or whatever metaphor you want to use. So that's clearly not the case. I mean, they are humans like we are humans with needs, with strength, but also with weaknesses. And so, take something like what you refer to sharing. Sharing is indeed an adaptive response to a certain context, a certain environment in which you may not be lucky every day in bringing home some food, and so sharing is a necessity. But what if you relieve people from that pressure? So food is now available abundantly, and so I think that also in hunter-gatherers undermines the sharing ethos and the egalitarian ethos. But in their environment, it is still limited the way an individual can accumulate wealth and material possessions and food because they simply can't store it for themselves, etc. But it doesn't mean that they don't have the needs to do better than their peers, if you like. That's also a fundamental need, but it's constrained by the environment. And so when you change the environment, suddenly these needs, for example, material possessions, they exacerbate and you get a sort of consumer culture. And so the answer then is, I think it is both. Our ancestral environment shows both, our hunter-gatherers show both the strength and weaknesses of human beings. But as long as we acknowledge that there are adaptations to local environments, that then implies to me that maybe we should change some of these environments to bring out the best, if you like, in us, to indeed promote a sharing culture again.
Yes.
It's a
Thank you, Mark.
long
So,
answer, but
no, that makes a lot of sense. And as you say, I think a key point you made there is not to romanticize kind of hunter gatherers. Yes, there are mismatches presented in the modern world, but there were clearly, downsides and adversity
Exactly.
experienced in such
Yeah.
societies.
Yeah.
Excellent. And lastly, Mark, we discussed briefly the glass ceiling
Yeah.
and how modern organizational structures dissuade women from, or could dissuade women from, pursuing more senior leadership roles. And I want to ask you, I don't think it's well discussed in Mismatch, but how much does career preferences and life priorities potentially explain the lack of women in senior leadership positions within organizations? So, that there are these, to put it another way, there are these structural limitation impediments. But are there,
Yeah.
on average, sex differences between men and women and women's desire to pursue such careers in the first place?
Yeah. So,
I appreciate this might be dynamite, but anyway, I'll
yes,
let you
no, but okay. So,
answer the question.
if I stick closely to our own data, we, for example, present men and women who work in various kinds of jobs. So with particular job ads from firms where we vary the levels of hierarchy in the firm. So some firms are described as being relatively egalitarian, sort of decentralized, with where salaries and sort of bonuses are more equally divided between the lower and higher levels of the jobs, whereas other firms are described as extremely hierarchical, both in their decision making and also in the allocation of status and rewards, etc. And not surprising, both actually men and women prefer the more egalitarian firms, where there are less differences in equality in status and power. But women particularly dislike firms that are described as highly unequal in both the decision making and in terms of resource allocation, bonuses and rewards, etc. And so that actually is a sort of common finding too. If you look at the developmental literature, where you see that girls tend to have a preference for what we call sort of strong social ties instead of a lot of weak social ties with many individuals. Girls tend to interact at a young age with a sort of smaller group of people which they have sort of somewhat deeper emotional connections. Now, if we then go to the modern workplace, and I'm not saying all modern workplaces, and there's also definitely trends towards more what we call holocracies, where individuals work together in units that are not highly formalized, where leadership roles are not highly unevenly distributed. So there are certain changes in the work environment too, but on the whole, women's psychology as well as I think their biology. The fact that if they want to have children, they're out of the workplace for some time. Those needs or those biological and psychological constraints means that they probably are less likely to compete for the top jobs in an organization where it takes maybe 20 or 30 years of very hard, highly committed work activities in order to get there. And so they drop out at various levels, unless, of course, they decide not to have children, for example, or not to have a relationship. But I think that's the wrong path to go. We should change the design of our organizations.
Yes.
To give women a fair chance, given the biological and psychological differences.
Thank you, Mark. And it's also thank you for referencing your recent research onto the topic matter. That is enlightening, to say the least.
Right.
And it supports your point about it being the organizational structure rather than a general preference which just manifests itself in all settings. It is the case that if given more support and different structures in place, that both men and women prefer such setups. Is that a fair summary of your research
Yeah,
and what you've concluded.
yeah, fully agree. Yeah.
Excellent. So those are the more challenging questions out the way, Mark. So I think finally, what I would like to ask you is, if there was a business leader listening to this episode, you may have inadvertently answered this, but just to pose it nonetheless, if there was a business leader listening to this episode, what's the most important action you would like them to take to address these various mismatches that we've discussed today?
Wow, a couple of things. I think one is that we have a sort of a human rights law, if you like, a universal law of what humans across the world are entitled to. That should also, I think, be happening in the workplace, where there is a sort of charter of what workers should be entitled to. And I mean there the physical design of the workplace, that is, access to nature should be really very important. Autonomy, where individuals have also some opportunity to spend time on their own projects, which I think is entirely possible given that we have such a highly professional and highly educated workforce at the moment. Offer incentives for teams and team achievements, not individual bonuses or salary increases, but only based on how well teams are performing. And I think leaders and managers should at least acknowledge and are probably already aware of that you cannot, as an individual, excel at your work if you're not part of a team. That's just not possible. And so reward these teams accordingly. Opportunities for learning. As humans, we want to sort of continue our learning experience of learning sort of new skills, so which we can increase our competencies and increase our prestige as workers. So opportunities for learning, lifelong learning, I think that's already happening in many workplaces. And these are some ideas I think that should be taken very seriously.
Excellent. That's a great way to summarize the implications of not only your book, but your broader research. So thanks a lot, Mark. Before we end, I think it may be worth mentioning this view of business, the Business Action Group. Would you like to tell people a bit about the TVOL Business Action Group and how people may be able to get involved?
Yeah, sure. So obviously the business group is part of the TV for this view of life, which applies evolutionary theory to all kinds of social matters, whether it's education, environmental awareness, but also the workplace. And so this view of business is particularly interested in applying broad sort of evolutionary principles to design more effective teams and organizations that are more aligned with both the constraints and the opportunities of human nature. And so we are both researchers, scientists who are doing original work on studying some of these interventions in the workplace. But we are scientists are nowhere if they are not matched up with practitioners who actually also have a lot of experience in the workplace and also know which things work and which may not work. So this is a call for anyone out there, practitioners or scientists who are interested in evolutionary principles, and see where we can find some common ground. And so we do that through various activities. Podcasts is one. We have regular position papers. So, for example, we published a set of documents or papers lately about what can Darwinian thinking help us to understand workplace behavior. We're thinking about also putting something together for business schools in particular. So how can they change their curriculum in order to teach students, business school students who are the managers of the future, to take more seriously that humans are not necessarily Homo economicus, but are Homo sapiens or an entirely cooperative species. And we're also, I think, planning activities, which you are obviously also an integral part of, about integrity in the workplace, business ethics. What are the sort of Darwinian evolutionary lessons for creating more ethical workplaces?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for that summary, Mark. And just to let people know, anyone listening that would like to get involved, I think the main page for TVOL 1000 can be accessed if you type in evolutioninstitute.org/TVOL 1000, and you should be able to access that page and get more information. Anyway, as always, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Mark. So thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with us today, and I'll speak to you very soon.
Okay, thanks for having me, Max.
Take care. All the best.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to This View of Life. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe in iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please consider rating it on iTunes and leaving a review to help others find the show. This View of Life is produced by the Evolution Institute, a nonprofit think tank whose mission is to provide science-based solutions for today's most pressing social issues in order to improve the quality of life. Learn more at evolution-institute.org. And if this view of life is important to you, then type TVOL 1000, TVOL 1000, to see how you can join the Darwinian Revolution.